Welcome back to Echoes of History. Tonight, the wind moves through the hills like a voice too old to remember its own words. The monastery stands alone, a shape of stone and shadow rising from the whiteness. Snow presses against the walls, gathering in silent drifts along the cloister. The air smells of smoke and frozen pine. Somewhere deep inside, a bell tolls once, the sound heavy, swallowed quickly by the storm. Inside the chapel, the air is still. Candles burn low, their flames bend. Toward each breath that passes, the light clings to the stone, trembling on the faces of the monks who kneel in prayer. Their hoods are drawn, their hands folded, their words too quiet to rise. The rhythm of their voices is slow, steady, a chant that does not plead, but endures. Between each phrase, silence lingers like a second kind of devotion. The walls are cold to the touch. Frost creeps in the corners where stone meets floor, spreading its white veins with the patience of time. A singer. Window, half covered in snow, lets in a pale light. Dust drifts through it, catching the gold of the candles and settling softly on the robes of the men who do not move. When the prayer ends, no one speaks. Sandals whisper across the floor. The monks file out through the narrow doorway, their shapes dissolving into the darker hall beyond. The last one pauses, pinches the wick of a candle between two fingers and closes the door. The chapel returns to stillness. In the kitchen, a small fire struggles against the cold. The room smells faintly of wood smoke and grain. A pot of thin soup simmers, barely bubbling. A monk stirs it slowly, his hand red from the heat. Steam rises, twisting into the air before disappearing into the rafters. Another monk brings a loaf of bread, the crust blackened from the fire, the inside pale and soft. They do not speak. One breaks the bread, the other pours the soup. They sit side by side on a wooden bench, their breath visible in the air. Outside continues to fall, fine, endless, soundless. It covers the paths, the courtyard, the well. The garden is a field of white mounds now, each marking what once was a row of herbs, a bench, a trough for rainwater. Beneath it all, the earth sleeps, waiting. From the scriptorium comes the faint scratch of a quill. The scribe sits wrapped in layers of wool, his ink thickening in the chill. The candle beside him has burned low, its wax spilling onto the table. He writes slowly, each line careful, deliberate. When his hand trembles, he stops, breathes into his fingers, and begins again. Outside the small window, the snow drifts past, slow, endless, without form. In the dormitory, the brothers sleep beneath rough blankets. The room smells of wax and cold linen. The wind presses against the shutters, rattling them softly but never breaking through. A faint sound of snoring rises and falls like waves. At the far end, a monk lies awake, staring at the ceiling. He listens. His breath to the distant rhythm of the river under ice. He counts the beats until thought dissolves and sleep finally finds him. Hours pass unnoticed. The fire burns down to embers. The snow deepens. The world outside disappears beneath the white. And yet within these walls, life continues, not loudly, not brightly, but with the quiet certainty of faith. Each moment is an act of endurance. Each breath is a prayer. The monastery stands unmoving between darkness and dawn and song, and the night, patient and vast, holds it in its frozen hand. The storm does not break with violence, it thickens, layer upon layer, until sound itself becomes a kind of memory. The world beyond the walls is gone, dissolved into white. The monastery stands within it like a heartbeat, faint but unceasing. Every door is sealed, every window heavy with frost. Inside, the air hums with stillness. At dawn, the bell rings once. The sound rises through the corridors, muffled. Tone round and full, like a pulse through stone. The monks wake without hurry. No one speaks. They move from their beds to the chapel, each footstep soft against the frozen floor. The air bites at their throats. Breath clouds in front of their faces, curling like incense in the dark. The chapel glows faintly with the first light of morning, a grey that holds no warmth. The candles have burned through the night, their stubs short, their wax pooled in uneven layers on the altar. One monk replaces them with new ones, pressing the bases into the old wax, lighting each with care. The new flames rise and waver, filling the air with a weak, honey-colored light. The others kneel, their heads bowed, their voices forming the same chant they have known since boyhood. Each note hangs in the air longer than it should. The sound rolls along the walls, across the floor, through the rafters. Outside, the snow presses against the windows, softening the echoes. What remains is not melody, but vibration, a hum that seems to come from the stones themselves. After prayers, the brothers disperse. In the refectory, breakfast waits, a crust of bread, a thin broth, a jug of water turned partly to ice. They eat in silence, the scrape of wooden spoons and bowls marking the only rhythm. A candle burns at the center of the table, its flame trembling with every movement of air. When the meal ends, they bow their heads in brief prayer, then rise and go about their duties. The abbot walks, cloister, his steps echoing softly against the vaulted ceiling. Snowlight filters through the arches, pale and diffused. He pauses by the courtyard, looking out at the white expanse where the garden once grew. The well is buried, the paths invisible. Only the top of the sundial remains, its frozen shadow stretching nowhere. He folds his hands into his sleeves, breathes once and turns away. In the kitchen, the fire is struggling again. The cook bends close to the coals, coaxing them with twigs. Sparks jump, hiss, vanish. When the flames finally catch, their warmth fills the room like a sigh. The smell of burning wood cuts through the damp air. Another monk enters with a bucket of snow. They melt it for water, pouring it into the part where a handful of lentils waits. The day passes without sound. In the scriptorium, the scribe works through the dim light, his quill whispering across the parchment. His breath fogs the surface each time he leans too close. The ink thickens and cools, refusing to flow. He warms it with a candle, dips the pen again, continues. The lines form slowly, not art, not beauty, but preservation. Names, prayers, small fragments of thought meant to outlast him. The pages dry brittle and pale, their corners curling in the chill. By afternoon, the snow outside has stopped. The sky turns a pale, indistinct silver, like the inside of a shell. The air is so still that smoke from the chimneys rises perfectly straight. The monks courtyard to clear the paths, their robes dark against the brightness. Shovels scrape softly at the snow, revealing patches of frozen earth beneath. Each breath hangs visible between them, each motion measured and quiet. When the sun begins to sink, its light enters the cloister at an angle, long and golden. It touches the arches, then fades. The snow glows pink for a moment before dimming to grey. The monks return inside, doors close. The fire is fed once more. Night comes lit again. The chants resume. The rhythm of prayer and silence folds into itself, the same pattern repeated endlessly, as if the day had not ended at all but only turned inward. In one of the dormitories, a young monk lies awake. He listens to the faint creak of timbers, to the drip of melting ice somewhere beyond the wall. The sound is soft, irregular, a reminder that even in stillness the world moves. He imagines the snow on the hills, the river below the ice, the trees bowed beneath. Wait, everything holding its breath until spring. He closes his eyes and the silence deepens. Beyond the walls, the Tiber glides unseen through the dark, black water slipping beneath frozen banks. Its motion is slow, ancient, endless, carrying with it fragments of the same world that the monks pray to preserve. The monastery sleeps, its candles burning low. The storm has passed, but the cold remains. And in that cold, between prayer and dream, between stillness and time, the winter stretches on, vast, weightless, eternal. By morning, the world is colorless again. The snow has hardened overnight into a smooth, unbroken crust that glints faintly beneath the gray light. The monastery stands motionless within it, its outlines softened by frost, its roof carrying the weight of silence. Smoke rises from a single chimney, thin and straight as though afraid to disturb the air. Inside, the bell rings twice, low, resonant, and slow. The sound drifts through the cloister, corridors lined with damp stone, through the dormitory where the monks stir beneath rough blankets. One by one they rise, draw their hoods, and move toward the chapel. Bare feet meet cold floor. The sound is a whisper, not a footstep. The chapel is darker than before. The candles burn to stubs in the night. The wicks tremble as they're relit. Their glow touches the altar, the edges of a wooden crucifix, the folds of fabric hanging in the apse. The air smells of wax and stone and smoke. The monks kneel, facing forward, their robes rustling faintly. Outside, the snow falls again, smaller flakes now, falling so slowly that they seem suspended. The chant begins. It has no melody, no ornament. It moves through the air like breath itself. Each word vanishes as soon as it is spoken, absorbed by the cold. The rhythm is older than memory, a sound that belongs to neither joy nor sorrow, only to endurance. When the prayer ends, they rise together. No command, no sig. Instinct, they file toward the refectory, heads bowed, hands hidden in their sleeves. The hall is dim, lit only by the coals of a low fire. Bread and water wait on the table. The bread is dark, thick with grain. The water smells faintly of smoke. They eat slowly without speech. The sound of chewing, the creak of benches, the soft breath of dozens of men. This is the morning hymn of survival. After the meal, work resumes. One monk tends the animals, breaking ice in their troughs. Enough. Carries logs from the shed, his footprints vanishing almost as soon as they're made. In the kitchen, a third monk grinds herbs to mix into a weak medicine for the sick. The sound of stone against stone echoes faintly through the hall. In the scriptorium, the scribe continues his work. His hand is steady but pale, his fingers cracked from cold. The ink has thickened overnight. He warms it near the flame before writing. His breath fogs the page, each exhale leaving a thin ghost upon the parchment. He does not wipe it away. He writes a single line, then waits. Outside the window, snow covers the world to the horizon. Nothing moves but the smoke from the chimneys. By midday, the sky darkens again. The air thickens with the promise of more snow. The monks gather in the cloister to clear the paths before the storm returns. The sound of shovels against ice is soft, rhythmic, unhurried. Their robes brush the snow as they work, the hem darkening from contact with the wet. The abb stands at the archway, watching, his hands clasped. He does not speak. There is nothing to say. A bell sounds from the chapel, one short, low note. It is the signal for prayer. The monks set their shovels aside and move wordlessly toward the sound. Inside, the candles burn brighter against the dark sky. The smell of incense curls upward, thin and sweet, blending with the scent of smoke and cold air. The chant begins again, slower this time, a murmur of voices rising and falling in you. Storm returns by evening. Snow strikes the windows, harder now, carried by wind. The corridors moan as the air forces its way through cracks. The fire in the kitchen flares and hisses. A door slams somewhere in the distance, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the roar outside. The monks retreat to their dormitories. Candles flicker in the draught, their flames stretching sideways. The air grows thick with cold and wax smoke. One of the younger brothers cannot sleep. He sits upright, watching the shadows dance across the ceiling. He hears the wind in the eaves, the whistle through the keyholes, the long breath of the world pressing against the walls. He closes his eyes, folds his hands, and begins to whisper a prayer not meant for words, only for warmth, for stillness, for another morning. Outside, the monastery disappears beneath the snow. The world narrows to the sound of wind and the slow, deliberate rhythm of the bell that tolls through the night, marking hours that no longer seem to exist. And through it all, the fire in the kitchen burns on, small, constant, defiant. Its glow reaches only a few feet, but within that circle of warmth, life persists. A loaf of bread rises slowly by its edge, a pot of broth hums faintly, and the shadows tremble in time with the breath of flame. Beyond the walls, winter reigns in silence. Within them, the monks endure not to conquer the cold, but simply to exist through it. And so the night begins again. Before it, prayer, silence, snow, and the steady pulse of faith echoing beneath the frozen stone. The storm continued through the night, a whisper that never quite became a roar. It wrapped itself around the monastery like a second wall, unseen, immense, alive. Snow buried the paths again, the cloister arches, the garden gate. The world beyond the walls was erased. There was only white wind and the pulse of flame inside the stone. At dawn, no bell rang. The ropes were frozen stiff. Ice. Yet the monks rose at the same hour, their bodies knowing before their minds did. They moved in silence through the corridors, their lanterns small against the vast grey cold. Wax dripped onto their sleeves as they passed. The smell of tallow mingled with the damp air, a faint sweetness that clung to their robes. The chapel was colder than before. The candles took longer to light. Each flame sputtered once, then steadied, filling the air with faint smoke that drifted upward in slow spirals. Frost glittered on the edges of the altar cloth, the glass of the window, even the pages of the book left open overnight. When the chant began, it sounded different, deeper, slower, as though the cold itself had entered their throats. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows in long, hollow breaths. Inside, the monks sang until the sound became something beyond prayer, not asking, not praising, but simply enduring, as if the act of making sound could hold back the emptiness that waited just beyond the walls. After the service, they dispersed again, not to the fields, for they were gone under snow, but to the work within. In the refectory, the cook cut small pieces of salted fish, thawed near the fire. The smell filled the room, sharp, heavy, mingled with smoke. A novice carried wood, his arms trembling from the weight. Another monk ladled thin broth into wooden bowls, steam curling upward, warming the faces bent over it. The sound of spoons against wood echoed. Faintly, the same rhythm repeated across the table. In the scriptorium, the cold made ink brittle. The scribe wrapped his hands in cloth and continued, each word deliberate, each breath visible in the light. The parchment curled from the warmth of the candle, and he pressed it flat again, gently, as though calming a restless child. Outside, flakes of snow clung to the window pane, melting slowly in the faint heat. The abbot moved through the corridors like a shadow. His steps made no sound. Stopped at each door, listening. The monastery spoke to him in its quiet, the creak of beams, the distant hiss of fire, the faint hum of voices at prayer. Every sound was proof of life, and so he listened to each one with care. By midday, the storm began to ease. The wind fell silent first, leaving behind a deep, breathless stillness. Then the snow stopped, not gradually, but all at once, as though the sky had simply closed its hand. The clouds thinned. The light changed. Windows, the monks could see nothing but white stretching to the horizon. The world was clean, featureless, absolute. The hills were gone, the trees buried. The river below the cliff was hidden beneath ice. The only movement was the faint drift of snow falling from the roof in long, heavy sheets. The brothers returned to the courtyard, their eyes narrowing against the brightness. The air stung their faces. They worked to clear the paths again, slow, steady strokes of the shovel. The sound was rhythmic, comforting. Each breath rose in pale plumes. When they paused, the only thing they heard was the soft crackle of settling snow. As the light faded, the sky turned from white to gold, then to the faintest shade of rose. The air warmed slightly. The snow began to glisten, each flake reflecting the dying sun like dusted glass. The monastery seemed to glow from within. That evening, the refectory was warmer. The fire had burned high all day, its heat trapped by the thick stone walls. Shadows danced across the benches, flickering with every shift of flame. The monks ate in silence as always, but the silence felt different, not heavy now, but full. When the abbot rose for the final prayer, his voice carried farther than usual, filling the hall like light. Night fell slowly. The snow outside reflected the moonlight, casting the courtyard in a faint, shimmering glow. The windows shone softly from within, each one a small square of gold in the endless white. The wind didn't return. In their dormitory, the brothers slept deeply, the sound of their breathing mingling with the faint hiss of the fire below. The walls, still cold, seemed less hostile now. Somewhere beyond the cloister, a bird called once, then again, a single, uncertain note breaking the silence. And for the first time in many days, dawn promised something beyond endurance. The snow would remain, the cold would return, but for this night, this single, perfect night, the monastery rested beneath a sky unbroken and still. The world outside slept in white, and within the walls, peace, fragile, fleeting, absolute, settled over the stones like the last falling flake of snow. The morning comes pale and distant, as though the light itself is hesitant to return. The sky holds the faint color of ash, the horizon blurring into the whiteness of snow. For a moment it is impossible to tell where the earth ends and the air begins. The monastery seems to float within it, a shadow of snow. In silence. The bell does not ring this morning, the rope is still frozen, but the brothers rise just the same. Habit is older than sound. They move through the corridors quietly, each step a familiar echo. The air bites at their skin. Breath gathers and fades in slow clouds. Frost glimmers on the edges of the iron sconces, on the latches, on the worn wood of the benches. In the chapel, the candles burn weakly, as though the cold has thinned their flame. The light spills unevenly across the altar, the walls, the bowed heads. The monks kneel, motionless, their robes heavy with dampness. The sound of their voices is small, only a hum, a shared vibration that fills the space between them. Prayer at this hour feels less like worship and more like continuation. The snow outside has settled. It is no longer falling but shifting, carried by faint currents of wind that twist and scatter it into fine powder. The garden lies beneath a perfect white sheet. The sundial is buried. Wooden fence has vanished except for the tips of its posts. The world has become smooth, weightless, without detail. After the prayers, the monks eat. The bread is thin, the broth thinner still. But there is warmth in the act itself, the motion of hands, the sound of bowls touching the table, the faint scrape of spoons. The refectory glows with the soft orange light of a single fire. The smoke rises lazily, curling into the vaulted ceiling before disappearing into the cracks between stones. In the scriptorium, the scribe begins again. His ink is dark, his breath steady. He writes slowly, his letters forming precise lines upon the pale parchment. The words are scripture, familiar, unchanging, but the act itself feels new each day. The room is silent except for the scratch of quill and the occasional creak of wood. The candle beside him burns unevenly, its wax running in rivulets down the holder. Each drop freezes before reaching the base. Elsewhere, the abbot walks. Arches cast long shadows across the snow-filled courtyard. He stops at each corner, looking out toward the hills beyond, the ones hidden now, though he knows their shapes by memory. His hand touches the stone. The cold seeps through his skin, sharp but grounding. He closes his eyes. In that stillness there is no time, no difference between one winter and the last. The world has always been this quiet, this waiting. By midday the clouds begin to part. A blade of sunlight cuts. Grey, striking the snow with sudden brilliance. The light moves slowly, creeping along the walls, illuminating every curve and imperfection. Ice glitters from the eaves. Drops of water form, fall, freeze again. The sound of melting begins, faint, rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock. The monks emerge into the courtyard, their eyes narrow against the light. For the first time in many days, shadows return. They fall long and blue across the snow. A few of the brothers start working, simply standing still, faces tilted toward the pale warmth. The sunlight touches their robes, their hands, the tops of their hoods, and for a moment the whole world seems to breathe. In the kitchen, the cook stirs a thicker soup today, lentils, barley, what little remains of dried herbs. The smell fills the hall, rich and heavy after weeks of thin broth. A novice brings water from the well, the bucket crusted with frost. When the fire flares, the walls glow gold and the cold retreats for a few feet. By evening, the sky turns clear. The last of the storm clouds drift away, revealing a full moon rising over the hills. Its light falls across the courtyard, turning the snow to silver. The arches throw their shadows again, perfect and still. The monks gather for final prayer. The chapel glows, candlelight mingling with moonlight, gold and white weaving together. Their voices rise softly, blending until no single one can be heard apart. The sound fills the air, warm and low. Silence rather than breaking it. When the prayer ends, they remain kneeling. No one moves. The candles flicker. The wind passes once through the cracks in the wall and fades. In that moment, everything holds still, the air, the breath, the world beyond the walls. And then the abbot speaks, not to command, not to bless, but to whisper the single word that ends the day. Pax, peace. The brothers bow their heads. The candles are extinguished one by one. The smoke curls into the darkness. Outside, the river runs beneath its ice, unseen but alive. The moon follows its surface, gliding beside it like a silent companion. The monastery sleeps. The cold deepens. The snow gleams faintly under the stars. And in that vast, motionless silence, neither empty nor full, only eternal, the world turns once more. Before dawn, the light returns as nothing more than a suggestion, a faint graying of the sky behind the hills, an outline forming where there had been only dark. Lies still, half buried beneath its own silence. The air outside is colder than any day before. The frost has turned the world brittle. Even sound seems to crack when it moves. Inside the walls, the cold has crept into everything. The water in the basins has frozen into thin, perfect sheets of ice. The floorstones shimmer faintly with frost. The air smells of wax, wood smoke, and the faint metallic edge of winter itself. When the monks rise, their breath mingles with candlelight, weaving into gold. The bell rope has thawed just enough to move. The sound comes slowly, one low note, drawn out, deep enough to tremble through the stone. It wakes no one. They are already awake. It is not a call but a confirmation. The day has returned, and so they must move again. The brothers gather in the chapel. The light is soft, blue, uncertain. The candles burn pale, their flames steady but weak. A line of monks kneel in silence, faces hidden within their hoods. From somewhere near, a single voice begins to chant low, slow, carrying through the still air like smoke through a narrow chimney. Others join in, their tones blending until the sound fills the room entirely, turning walls and air into a single vibrating surface. Outside, the snow shifts. The sky lightens by degrees. When prayer ends, they move to their tasks. One goes to the stable, brushing frost from the mule's coat. Another clears a path to the well, striking the ice with the edge of a shovel. Each motion is deliberate, conserving strength. The world allows no wasted movement here. In the scriptorium, the scribe works beside a new candle. The flame flickers, throwing gold against the parchment. His hands tremble, but his lines are precise. Every word is written with a kind of reverence, not for meaning, but for permanence. What he writes will not be read soon, perhaps never, but it will exist, and that is enough. At midday, the clouds part again. The sky opens briefly, showing of color, not blue, not gray, but something between, soft and unmeasured. The light falls through the cloister arches, spreading across the snow. The reflections shimmer faintly, rippling like breath. The brothers pause their work, not in wonder but in acknowledgement. They know the sun will vanish again soon. Still, for a moment, the world feels gentler. In the kitchen, warmth gathers around the fire. The cook hums softly to himself as he stirs a pot of broth. The sound of the wooden spoon against the rim is steady, rhythmic, like a clock marking time in a place where time no longer matters. A novice enters with arms full of wood. Snow melts on his sleeves and runs down to the floor, pooling in quiet circles before vanishing into the cracks. The abbot visits each room, as he does every day. He speaks rarely, offering no instruction. His presence is enough. When he enters the chapel, he stops before the altar and touches the cold surface of the stone. The wax from candles has hardened in small, translucent folds. He runs his hand over them gently, as though smoothing wrinkles from fabric. Then he bows his head, murmurs a prayer too soft to hear, and leaves. Afternoon fades quickly. The light narrows to a thin band along the western wall, then disappears. The temperature drops again. The snow outside begins to sparkle with the faint reflection of a rising moon. The monks gather once more for evening prayers. The chapel is warmer now. The air smoke and the scent of melted wax. Their chant rises slowly, winding through the arches. It no longer sounds like voices, only vibration, breath turned to sound, human persistence against the vastness outside. When the last note fades, the silence that follows feels larger than the room itself. It spreads outward, filling the halls, the cloister, the night. Later, in the dormitory, the brothers sleep in rows beneath their coarse blankets. A single candle burns at the far end. Unmoving, the snow outside reflects enough light to make the walls glow faintly. The world seems suspended between motion and stillness, warmth and cold, life and something just beyond it. The river far below the hill begins to thaw. Beneath its frozen surface, the current has been moving all along, unseen, unstoppable. The faint sound of it, soft, secret, patient, drifts through the still air. And within the monastery, the same quiet persistence endures, the steady rhythm of prayer, of waiting. Winter holds them, but it does not conquer. The candles burn low. The river flows. The night, immense and eternal, continues its slow turning toward the promise of spring. The next morning dawned without a sound. The world seemed paused between seasons, snow no longer falling, but not yet melting. The air no longer fierce, but still sharp enough to draw tears when breathed too deeply. The monastery sat half-veiled in mist, its towers dissolving into a whitener. Edge, the bell did not ring this time. Instead, the monks woke to the creak of timber under frost. The sound came from every beam, every joint, as though the building itself were sighing after the long night. The brothers rose, drew their hoods, and moved through the corridors that still smelled faintly of smoke and damp stone. The chapel was dim. Candles burned in a small cluster near the altar, their light steady and warm against the cold blue of early morning. The monks entered one by one. Heads bowed, sandals whispering across the floor. They knelt without instruction. The chant began as it always did, slow, measured, each word suspended in air long after it was spoken. Through the narrow windows, the first sunlight of several days reached them. It fell across the floor in thin ribbons, catching the floating dust, turning it gold. The frost on the window glass melted at its touch, leaving small trails that glimmered like veins of light. When the prayers ended, the brothers did not move at once. The silence after the chant was deep, but not empty. It hummed faintly, like the world itself holding its breath. Then one monk rose, his robe brushing against the stone, and the others followed, their motions slow but certain. In the kitchen, the fire had burned through the night. The last of the embers glowed under a layer of ash. The cook bent low, blew gently, and watched the red deepen to orange, then flare. The warmth spread outward, catching the edges of the room. Drawing color back into the world, he placed a part of snow over the flame to melt. The sound of dripping water echoed like music in the quiet. A novice swept the corridor outside, his broom tracing faint patterns into the frost-dusted floor. Each sweep left a clean path, then disappeared as vapor rose from his breath. The air was so cold that every motion left a mark. The touch of a hand, the press of a sandal, the faint cloud of exhaled heat. By midday, the mist lifted. For weeks, revealed itself again, arches rimmed with ice, the wellhead glinting faintly, the footprints of monks crisscrossing in gentle order. A single patch of stone showed through near the center where the sun struck directly. Its grey surface steamed slightly in the light. The abbot stood in the archway, hands folded in his sleeves, watching. He did not speak, nor did he smile, but there was something in his stillness that suggested release, an awareness that the worst of winter had passed. In the scriptorium, the scribe paused his work to watch a drop of melted ice trace down the window pane. It caught the light, trembled, and fell onto the sill. He dipped his quill again and continued, his letters smoother now, his ink flowing more easily in the warmth. The rhythm of life resumed in small ways. The hammer of the smith struck faintly in the courtyard. The sound of a mule's bridle jingled as the brothers carried hay to the stable. A pot clinked in the kitchen. A door closed. A faint breeze stirred the air. Each sound carried weight, like proof that the world had not been lost to silence. By late afternoon, the sun turned golden. Its light spread over the snow until it glowed like metal. The river below the hill shimmered faintly, its surface breaking in places where the ice had begun to yield. From the open gate, the monks could hear it, soft, steady, alive. They stood together for a while, saying nothing. Their breath rose in silver plumes, the sound of the river, mingled with the low hum of the wind. When they turned back toward the monastery, the last light followed them, stretching their shadows long across the snow. Inside, the fire burned higher that night. The refectory was warm enough that they could remove their hoods. Steam rose from the bowls of soup, curling upward into the candlelight. The abbot gave the blessing, his voice calm, even the same words spoken every evening since any of them could remember. After the meal, one by one, the monks drifted toward their chambers. The air grew quiet again, filled only with the faint sound of footsteps, then none at all. Outside, the snow reflected the moon, the light clean and cold, the hills clear against the sky for the first time in weeks. Somewhere deep within the walls, the last ember of the kitchen fire cracked, flared, and went out. Smoke rose gently, then vanished. The monastery slept. The world beyond was frozen still, yet alive in its quiet persistence. The river ran on, its shell of ice, unseen, eternal. And in the heart of the silence, beneath the breath of prayer and time, winter began to loosen its hold. By the next morning, the air had changed. It was still cold, still heavy with the taste of frost, but the wind carried something different now, a thin, wet scent of earth waking beneath the snow. The sky was not gray, but pale and streaked with faint color, like the first wash of pigment on a blank page. Somewhere in the distance, unseen but certain, was moving again. The monks rose as they always did, their movements unhurried, practiced, almost soundless. Yet there was a faint quickness to them, not eagerness, but the quiet sense that the world beyond their walls had shifted. The youngest among them paused at the small window near his bed, wiping the frost away with his sleeve. The hills were still white, but the snow near the river had darkened to the color of wet stone. The bell rang once, the first clear tone in weeks. It carried through the corridors, across the courtyard, up into the rafters. Dust fell in thin threads from the beams, glittering faintly in the light that entered through the cracks. The chapel was filled with that light. It spilled through the high windows, soft and gold, melting the edges of shadow. The candles burned brighter in it, their flames thin and upright. The chant began as usual, but the sound was different, lighter somehow, its rhythm less burdened. The voices moved together easily, like oars dipping into calm water. When the prayer ended, the silence that followed was not heavy but alive. The abbot lingered at the altar, his hand resting on the worn stone. The warmth from the candles spread into his skin. He looked toward the window, where the light pooled against the frost, and allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment longer than usual. In the refectory, the air no longer bit at the skin. The fire burned steady, its smoke rising in straight grey ribbons. The cook hummed softly as he worked. The broth simmered thicker today, with the last of the lentils and a small measure of oil. The smell filled the hall, not rich, but comforting. Outside, the snow was breaking. From the cloister arches, the brothers could see water running in thin lines down the walls, pooling in the cracks between stones. Drops fell from the eaves with a soft rhythm, each one marking the slow undoing of winter. The sound echoed faintly in the courtyard, blending with the low hum of the wind. A few monks had been sent to clear the path to the gate. Their shovels cut into the melting crust, the snow giving way easily now. Beneath it, the ground was dark, rough and uneven, the first sign of life returning. The sun caught the wet stone, and for the first time in months, the monastery shimmered, walls glistening, paths shining, the air filled with a quiet brightness. The abbot joined them, standing by the gate with his hands folded in his sleeves. He watched as the brothers worked, their breath mingling with the mist that rose from the ground. When they finished, he nodded once, not as command, but acknowledgement. The gate was clear. Beyond it, the path down to the river was visible again, narrow and half-buried, but open. In the scriptorium, the scribe paused to warm his hands above the candle. He no longer needed to breathe on the ink to keep it fluid. The pages dried faster now, curling slightly in the faint heat. He could hear the dripping outside, steady, continuous, like a clock restarting after a long pause. By afternoon, the light had turned golden. The river below was visible once more, not fully free, but alive in places where the current had broken through the ice. The sound of it reached the cloister, a faint, constant murmur, the earth remembering how to move. The monks gathered near the gate again, not to work but to stand in silence. The air around them was soft now, almost warm against the face. The snow still coved. Here and there, dark patches of soil showed through, like ink bleeding through parchment. Evening came gently. The candles in the chapel glowed steady and tall. The chants that night were softer, slower, the voices blending like smoke. No one spoke of change, but all could feel it in the air, in the walls, in the quiet between words. When the prayers ended, the abbot remained behind. He looked toward the altar, where a single candle burned lower than the rest. Its wax pooled and spread. Its flame leaned, then straightened again. He whispered the last words of the service alone. Outside, the snow continued to melt. The water ran beneath the walls, trickling down toward the river that waited, dark and endless. The sound of it was constant, small, patient, alive. The monastery slept. The air carried the scent of thawing earth, of wood smoke and water. And though winter still lingered in the shadows, something new had begun, not loud, not visible, but certain. The silence of survival was giving way to the quiet of return. The first true thaw came quietly. It did not announce itself with warmth or wind, but with the slow, persistent sound of dripping. At first it was faint, a few scattered notes echoing from the eaves and gutters, but by dawn it had become a rhythm steady and patient, as if the monastery itself were breathing again after a long sleep. The snow still blanketed everything, but its edges had softened. The courtyard that had been a sheet of white now gleamed with patches of silver and grey, where water pooled in shallow depressions. The walls were streaked with melt, dark stone glistening beneath layers of running ice. In the air there was movement, a whisper of something warmer, a hint of the earth returning. Inside, the bell rang clearer than it had all winter. The frozen rope had loosened at last, and the sound that rolled through the cloister was full and round, echoing deep into the still corridors. It was not loud, but it carried Far through the dormitories, through the refectory, through every cold chamber where the monks had waited out the long season. They gathered in the chapel as always, but this morning the light was different. It was not the brittle blue of frost, but the pale gold of a distant sun. Dust and smoke drifted through it, alive and visible for the first time in months. The candles, fewer now, burned stronger, their flames straight and clean. The chant began, and for a moment it seemed that the world outside had stopped to listen. The snow beyond the walls caught the sound and held it, reflecting it back in faint vibration. The rhythm was the same as it had always been, low, continuous, unadorned, but beneath it was something almost new, a tremor of warmth, a subtle pulse of life returning to frozen things. After the service, they moved into the courtyard. The air was cool and wet, filled with the scent of thawing soil. Water dripped from the arches, pattering onto the flagstones below. The garden lay buried still, but the tops of the fence posts had reappeared, and near the wall a patch of brown earth showed through. A novice knelt beside it, running a finger across its surface, surprised by how soft it felt. The abbot stood near the well, his hood drawn low, his breath misting in the air. He watched as the brothers worked, clearing snow, lifting branches that had broken under the weight, scraping ice from the steps. The sound of their tools mingled with the constant dripping, the whisper of melting, the faint hum of wind. It was the sound of motion returning after a long stillness. By midday the sun broke through fully. The courtyard glowed, the walls shimmering, the snow blindingly white. The monks shielded their eyes, unused to brightness. For a few moments the world seemed made entirely of light and water. Steam rose from the melting ground, curling in thin spirals. A bird, unseen all winter, called from somewhere beyond the gate. Its note was small, fragile, and yet it carried farther than the bell. In the kitchen, the fire burned high. The cook leaned close, stirring a pot that had simmered since morning. It was thicker now, richer. The smell of herbs and grain filled the hall, soft and warm. The novice who brought the wood smiled faintly as he passed, and though no one spoke, the gesture was enough, the kind of wordless exchange that only happens when silence itself has become a language. The scriptorium was brighter too. The sun struck the window and scattered gold across the work table. The scribe paused, his quill lifted above the parchment. For the first time in weeks, he could hear the sound of water outside, dripping from the gutters, running along the stones. It mixed with the scratching of his pen, two forms of persistence, both slow, both steady. By late afternoon, the snow on the roofs began to slide. Long sheets broke free, crashing to the ground with dull, heavy thuds that echoed like distant thunder. The monks stopped their work each time, looking up, not in fear but in reverence. The sound marked another moment of change, another fragment of winter falling away. In the cloister, the abbot paused by the open arch. The sun was low now, its light deepening into amber. Shadows stretched long across the courtyard, reaching from wall to wall like slow-moving water. He listened to the dripping, the melting, the quiet shuffle of robes. Then, softly, he spoke the first words he had uttered. Tempus transit. Time passes. The words hung in the air for a long while, absorbed by the stone, by the cold, by the centuries themselves. Then the monks bowed their heads and returned to their work. When evening came, the sky cleared completely. The first stars appeared before the sun had even disappeared. The snow reflected them faintly, the ground glowing as if lit from beneath. The river below the hill moved freely now, dark water sliding beneath the last remnants of ice. Its sound, steady, soft, constant, a heartbeat running through the valley. The brothers gathered once more in the chapel. The candles burned tall, their light mirrored in the wet sheen of the floor. The air was warmer, though no one mentioned it. They knelt as they always did, their robes brushing the stone, their voices rising in slow unison. The chant filled the air like breath itself, the same rhythm that had guided them through every season, every silence. When it ended, no one moved. The light flickered, the last notes lingered, and the quiet that followed was full of dripping, of wind, of life returning. Outside, the snow continued to melt beneath the stars. Water traced its slow path toward the river, gathering, pooling, running, each drop carrying the echo of winter's long stillness away. And within the monastery, beneath its ancient arches and patient walls, the sound of life, fragile, rhythmic, enduring, began again. The thaw deepened over the days that followed, though no one could name when winter truly ended. It was not a single moment, but a gradual softening of air, of earth, of the silence that had filled every stone. The monastery no longer felt sealed against the world. It breathed again, faintly but freely, each hour carrying with it a subtle trace of warmth. In the early morning, mist rose from the ground. It moved low across the courtyard, curling through the cloister arches like smoke. The monks walked through it silently, their shapes half erased, ghost-like in the half-light. The bell sounded once, then twice, its tone slow and deep. The vibration lingered in the fog, dissolving only after several heartbeats. The chapel smelled of damp wax and thawing air. Frost had receded from the windows, leaving narrow streaks of clear glass through which the world outside shimmered. The sky was pale, not grey now, but the color of worn linen. The candles burned tall, their light dancing on the wet stone. When the chant began, it was to plead for endurance, but to honor the simple fact of another morning. After prayers, the monks dispersed to their duties. For the first time in months, the gate was unbarred. Beyond it, the road to the river had reappeared soft, uneven, streaked with mud. Two brothers were sent to inspect the bridge. They walked in silence, their sandals sinking into the earth. Along the path, the snow thinned, revealing the dull green of moss clinging to the rocks. The air carried the faint scent of river, water and decaying leaves, a smell that spoke of life beginning again beneath the surface. When they reached the riverbank, they stood for a long while without speaking. The Tiber moved slowly but freely now, its ice broken and drifting downstream in silent, gleaming fragments. The sound was low and continuous, the murmur of distance, of movement rediscovered. The brothers crossed themselves, then turned back toward the hill, the wet path gleaming beneath their feet. Within the monastery, the rhythm of the day had shifted. The kitchen fire no longer burned through the night. It was enough now to light it in the morning and let it fade by dusk. The air inside the refectory felt different, lighter, less burdened by smoke. The soup simmered, thicker and richer, with the first handfuls of dried herbs brought from storage. When the bowls were placed before the brothers, steam rose in soft clouds that carried the scent of thyme and wood. In the scriptorium, the sunlight lasted longer. It filled the room until the shadows retreated into the corners. The scribe worked without his gloves now. His fingers, still marked by cracks, moved with steadier rhythm. Each letter was a quiet act of devotion, not to beauty or to meaning, but to endurance itself. On the wall beside him, melted frost left narrow trails that glittered like veins of light. By midday, the air outside had warmed enough that the snow along the southern wall began to slide. It fell in long, heavy sheets that with dull, wet thuds. Beneath each collapse, the dark stone emerged, slick and shining, streaked with lines of water that caught the sun. The brothers worked together to clear the runoff, their shovels scraping softly, the sound rhythmic and low. The abbot watched from the cloister. His hands were clasped behind his back, his robe stirring slightly in the breeze. For the first time since autumn, he lifted his face toward the sun. Its warmth was faint but real. He closed his eyes and stood there a while, as though measuring how much of himself still belonged to the cold and how much had already been reclaimed by the light. In the evening, the sky turned clear and colorless. The snow on the hills reflected the last gold of the sun, then dimmed into gray. The monks gathered for prayer once more, their voices soft, unhurried. Between each verse, the silence no longer felt empty. It was filled with the sounds of water dripping from the roof, of wood settling, of the river moving. Beyond the walls, when the service ended, the abbot remained alone in the chapel. The candles burned low, their wicks whispering faintly. He walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard, at the dark paths cutting through the snow, at the faint mist rising from the ground. For the first time in months he could hear birds. Their calls were distant, uncertain, but unmistakable. He whispered the same word he had spoken to the walls years before when another winter had ended. Revertita. It returns. The world, the warmth, the sound, all of it coming back as it always did. He stood there until the candles burned down, until the night gathered fully. Outside, the river flowed louder now, its surface alive with moonlight. The monastery glowed faintly beneath the stars, each window a small ember in the vast dark. And as the last of the ice broke apart in the current, the monks slept, not from weariness, but from a long, deep peace born of survival. The cold had not completely, but it no longer ruled. The earth had begun to breathe again, and the monastery breathed with it, slow, patient, eternal. Morning came with a hush so complete it felt like reverence. The world outside was still damp with melt, the last fragments of snow clinging to the shaded corners of walls, the hollows of steps, the ridges of the stone garden beds. The light was gentler now, golden rather than white. It fell through the high windows in long columns that caught the drifting, turning it to slow-moving gold. The bell rang twice, the sound deeper, rounder, freer than it had been all winter. The metal no longer cracked with frost. It vibrated cleanly through the cloister and across the fields beyond. The monks stirred at the sound, not hurried, but no longer weighed down by cold. They rose and moved through the corridors with quiet ease. The air was warmer, softer against their faces, and in the distance they could hear water running from the eaves, 1,000 small rivers finding their way back to the earth. The chapel glowed. The candles burned evenly, their flames tall and steady. The scent of melted wax mixed with the faint sweetness of damp stone. The chant began, a low harmony that rolled through the air like the turning of a tide. For the first time in months, sunlight and sound filled the space together, one golden, one human, moving in the same slow rhythm. When the prayer ended, the monks filed into the courtyard. The snow had receded almost completely from the paths, leaving slick stones beneath their sandals. Puddles reflected the sky, shifting with every breath of wind. The abbot stood near the well, his hands folded in front of him. His face, lined and pale, was turned upward toward the faint blue. His eyes were closed, but he smiled, a small, fleeting thing that faded almost as soon as it appeared. Work resumed without instruction. 2 brothers swept the last of the ice from the cloister. Another carried broken branches. The garden. A novice filled buckets from the well, his reflection moving with the ripples. The sound of water, dripping, pouring, flowing, was everywhere now, echoing softly off the stone walls. In the kitchen, the fire burned easily. The logs caught with a single spark, and the flames leapt high, bright against the dark soot of the hearth. The cook added dried peas to the pot, the sound of them striking the metal like rain. Steam rose, thick and fragrant. When he leaned closer, the warmth washed over his face, and his eyes closed for a moment, not from prayer but from quiet gratitude. In the scriptorium, the air was alive with light. The scribe worked without his cloak now, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His quill moved steadily, the ink flowing smoothly in the gentle heat. Outside the window, a patch of earth had appeared where the snow once lay. He could see something moving there, small shoots of green pressing through the thawing soil. They bent under the weight of a drop of water, then straightened again. By midday, the river was fully awake. From the upper terrace, the monks could see it gleaming far below, its surface catching the sun in long ribbons. The sound carried faintly through the valley, low, steady, endless. It was the same sound that had been there in every season, only hidden by ice and silence. The abbot gathered a few of the brothers near the gate. They stood together, looking toward the hills where the snow still lingered. He spoke quietly, his voice blending with the wind. Omnia redunt. Everything returns. They nodded. None replied. There was no need. When the sun began to set, the air turned cool again, but not cold. The sky deepened to amber, then to a violet that hung low over the hills. The first stars appeared, faint at first, then sharp. The river glowed in the twilight like a moving thread of light. Inside the chapel, the monks gathered once more. The candles were lit in rows along the walls, their reflections trembling. The wet sheen of the floor. The chant began slower than usual, softer, not in mourning, but in remembrance. The words spoke of renewal, though none of them thought of spring by name. It was simply the continuation of breath, the turning of the world. When it ended, no one rose. They remained kneeling as the last note faded into silence. Outside, a single drop fell from the roof and struck the ground, followed by another and another, the final rhythm of the season passing. Later that night, the monastery slept beneath a sky so clear it seemed made of glass. The walls glowed faintly with the reflection of moonlight. The courtyard glistened with thawing ice. From somewhere beyond the gate came the sound of frogs, the first in months, their voices fragile and uncertain, breaking the long silence with a trembling song. In his cell, the abbot lay awake. He listened to the river, the frogs, the faint creak of wood in the rafters. He thought of the snow, of the nights when breath had frozen midair, of the endless prayers whispered into darkness. And then he thought of this, the quiet, the warmth, the sound of life returning in small, steady ways. He closed his eyes. The silence folded around him, gentle and complete. Outside, the last of the snow melted into the earth. The river carried it away, drop by drop, night by night, until nothing remained but the echo of its passage. And in the heart of the monastery, under its ancient roof and patient stone, time slow, circular prayer, the passing, the waiting, the return. By the next morning, the monastery was no longer a fortress against the cold, but a vessel filled with sound. Water ran from every gutter, every arch, every crevice in the stone. The melting snow had become a chorus, soft, irregular, endless. It mingled with the cooing of doves that had returned to the cloister roof, with the creak of wood as the walls dried, with the faint rustle of robes as the monks passed between shadows. The bell rang 3 times. Its voice carried far now, across the open valley, unbroken by wind. The air was light and damp, tasting of iron and thawing earth. Inside the dormitory, the light reached farther than before, touching the farthest corners that winter's darkness had claimed. The brothers rose slowly, their movements no longer cautious but natural, unburdened. They washed their faces in water that was cold but not frozen, pulled on their robes, and moved through the corridors where footsteps no longer echoed like stones in a tomb. The chapel was filled with gold. The sun entered through the high windows in long, shimmering beams that reached all the way to the altar. The air inside was clear, almost warm. The monks' breath no longer fogged as they chanted. The sound of their voices moved easily through the space, rising and falling like wind in tall grass. The light shifted with the rhythm of their song, passing over their faces, the folds of their robes, the roughness of the walls. After prayer, they filed into the courtyard. The snow was gone except for a few stubborn patches that clung to the edges of the stones. Beneath them, the earth was soft, black and glistening. Moss spread along the base of the walls, thick and green, like a slow return of memory. The air smelled of mud and new life. The abbot stood by the well, watching as the brothers uncovered the garden beds. Their tools struck the soil, breaking the crust of winter, turning the dark earth. Beneath, each sound was small, steady, deliberate. A novice knelt to touch the soil, pressing it between his fingers, then lifting it to his face. The scent of it, deep, damp, alive, made him close his eyes. In the scriptorium, the scribe had moved his desk nearer to the window. He worked with both panes open now, letting the wind turn his pages. The ink dried quickly in the light. The air carried the scent of wet wood and smoke. From outside came the sound of distant bells from a valley, faint, uneven, but full of life. He smiled without realizing it and kept writing. By midday, the river had swollen. From the hilltop, its motion was visible, dark, restless, full of fragments of ice and wood drifting downstream. Its edges glittered in the sunlight. The sound of it reached the monastery like a low, constant breathing. The world that had been silent for months was now alive with motion. In the kitchen, the cook prepared the first meal of the new season. Lentil, thickened with barley, a crust of fresh bread baked over coals. The air was fragrant, heavy with warmth. The sound of bubbling filled the room like a quiet hymn. When the meal was served, the brothers ate in the same silence as always, but the silence was lighter now, like a space filled with meaning rather than absence. After the meal, the abbot walked alone through the cloister. Drops fell from the roof in a steady rhythm. He listened as he walked, his sandals soft against the damp floor. The air was cool but gentle. At one of the arches, he stopped and looked toward the hills. The snow had retreated to the highest ridges, thin and blue against the sky. Below, the fields were streaked with dark furrows where the earth had reappeared. He stood for a long time, the sound of water around him. It ran from the roof, down the gutters, across the stones. It was the same sound in every direction, the slow undoing of winter, the quiet restoration of what had always been waiting beneath. When evening came, the sky turned copper. The last light touched the walls of the monastery, turning them warm and bright before fading into gray. The brothers gathered for prayer again, their candles glowing like embers. The chant was softer now, less burdened, the rhythm of it closer to breathing than to song. Outside, the first insects began to stir. A single fly buzzed in the corner of the refectory. A moth brushed against the window. The frogs along the river began their call, low and rhythmic, as though answering the monk's prayer in another language. Later, when darkness fell, the stars appeared clear and sharp above the valley. The river shone faintly, winding through the night like a ribbon of silver. The walls of the monastery gleamed with the reflected light of the moon. The abbot stood once more by the gate before retiring. He looked out into the vast quiet, the fields, the forest, the river below. The world was not peaceful, not yet. It was wet, restless, full of change, but it was alive again. He whispered into the wind the words the brothers would never hear. Et tamen vita manit. And yet life remains. Then he turned, closed the gate, and the monastery settled into sleep. In the night, the last trickles of melting snow found their way into the river. The water carried them softly away, joining the current that had never stopped beneath the ice. And within those walls, so long silent, so long still, the rhythm of existence continued. Breath, rest, renewal. Winter had ended, but its memory remained, folded quietly into the stone. The days began to lengthen almost without notice. What had once been darkness at the hour of prayer was now a dim blue, and soon after, a pale light spilled through the narrow windows. The world outside the monastery no longer seemed distant. It had color again, faint, earthy browns where the snow had receded, flashes of green clinging to the edges of stones, the shimmer of water poo. Where fields would soon reappear. Each morning the monks woke to sound, not the silence of frost or the muffled stillness of snow, but the murmur of the river, the wind moving through thawed branches, the irregular tapping of water dripping from the eaves. The air carried scent again, damp soil, smoke, and, faintly, the sweetness of growing things. The bell rang freely now, no longer dull with ice. Its tone spread out across the valley, clear and round. In the distance, the echoes came back. Softened, blurred by mist, the monks rose at once. Their sandals no longer clung to frozen floors. their robes brushed against stone that held warmth again. In the chapel, the candles burned brighter, but the sunlight was stronger still. It entered through the high windows in gold shafts, washing the altar, the faces, the walls. Dust floated within it like 1,000 drifting prayers. The chant began familiar words, steady rhythm, but the sound carried differently now. It no longer pressed against the cold. It moved freely through the air, touching stone and glass, dissolving into brightness. When the prayer ended, the monks lingered. The light fell over them in bands of color where it passed through the stained glass. One novice, youngest of the brothers, lifted his eyes for a moment, watching the light play across the floor, the red and blue shapes shifting slowly as the sun rose. He smiled before bowing his head again. In the refectory, warmth gathered. The fire burned. Gently, no longer fighting against the cold. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, bread, and broth. The cook worked slowly, stirring the pot, his face damp from steam. Outside the window, a bird landed briefly on the ledge, small, grey, cautious. It pecked once, twice, and flew away, leaving a trace of feathers against the stone. The brothers ate in silence as always, but the quiet was softer now, almost companionable. The scrape of bowls, the rustle of sleeves, the sound of wood, all of it formed a rhythm that felt alive. When the meal ended, they bowed their heads, rose, and dispersed without a word. Outside, the courtyard was wet and glimmering. The garden beds had begun to darken with exposed soil. A few herbs, thought dead, were stirring back to life, green tips pushing through the black earth. The abbot stood by the archway, watching. His robe moved slightly in the wind. He looked out beyond the wall where the hills were streaked with shadow and light, the last of the snow receding into gullies. He listened to the sound of the water dripping from the roof. Each drop was clear, bright, measured. It struck the stone, then ran into the cracks, joining the hidden veins that led to the river below. For a long time, he simply stood there, watching the slow rhythm of it, the monastery breathing with the world again. In the scriptorium, the windows were open for the first time in months. The air that entered carried the scent of damp grass and burning wood from a distant hearth. The scribe worked with sleeves rolled back, his hands steady. He no longer had to pause to warm his fingers. The parchment glowed in the sunlight, the ink dried in thin, glistening lines. Every stroke of the quill felt like motion returning to the stillness of winter. By midday, the light was warm enough to reach the deepest corridors. Shadows retreated. The walls shone faintly where the dampness was drying. The air hummed with small sounds, dripping, footsteps, the soft hiss of a door closing. Even silence had changed. It carried the residue of life now. In the garden, 2 monks dug channels to guide the meltwater away from the walls. Their shovels bit easily into the softened earth. The smell of wet soil rose around them. They worked without speaking, pausing only when the sun broke through the clouds, its warmth touching their faces. They closed their eyes for a moment, feeling the light through their eyelids, red and gold and endless. By evening, the valley was full of mist. It rose from the river and rolled upward, filling the lower fields, curling around the monastery walls. The air was cool again, but not harsh. The first frogs had begun to sing from the reeds, their voices faint, uneven, carried upward by the damp wind. The monks gathered in the chapel. The candles flickered low, their flames mirrored in the polished surface of the altar. The chant began, slower now. Each note held longer, deeper. The voices filled the air and mingled with the sound of the frogs outside, the faint crack of firewood in the kitchen, the steady pulse of dripping water. When the prayer ended, the brothers knelt for a moment longer. The silence that followed was not empty but layered, the sound of the world continuing beyond the walls. The abbot remained after the others had gone. He walked to the window and looked out at the mist, the faint glow of moonlight caught in its folds. Beneath it, the river shone like a moving thread of light. He listened to the water, the wind, the breath of the monastery itself. And in that moment, everything felt suspended, the world neither winter nor spring, but something between, something timeless. He closed his eyes and whispered, not in prayer but in quiet acknowledgement, Sikatarat. As it was, the candles burned lower, the mist drifted higher, the river moved on, unceasing, indifferent, eternal. And in the heart of the monastery, where time passed not in days but in silences, life continued as gently and as inevitably as the turning of the earth beneath the thawing sky. The final thaw came not with rain or wind, but with stillness. By dawn, the last traces of snow had vanished from the courtyard, leaving behind dark stones slick with water and the faint smell of earth waking beneath the weight of months. The river below no longer hid beneath ice. It ran free and full, its surface catching the light like moving glass. The monastery, which had endured so long, seemed to exhale at last. The bell rang once. Its sound moved cleanly through the air, untouched by frost or fog, clear enough to make the doves scatter from the roof. The monks rose from their beds without the heavy motion of winter, their bodies remembering warmth again. Their breath no longer formed clouds in the dim corridors. The air was cool, but alive, heavy with the scent of wet stone and the faint sweetness of new growth. The chapel was bright before the candles were lit. Morning. Light spilled through the windows in wide bands of gold and white. Dust drifted through it like ash in water. When the monks entered, the floor shone beneath their feet. They took their places, heads bowed, and waited for the abbot's signal. The chant began. It was the same melody as always, simple, steady, unadorned, but this morning it seemed lighter, as if the voices had been freed of the weight they'd carried through the long nights. The sound moved through the chapel and out into the courtyard, where it mingled with the hum of wind and the murmur of the river. When it ended, they stayed kneeling longer than usual. No one wished to break the silence that followed. Outside, a bird called, a clear, solitary note that hung in the air before fading into distance. The abbot raised his head, eyes half closed, as if listening for something beyond hearing. After prayer, the brothers stepped into the courtyard. The air was full of light. The puddles from yesterday had dried into thin mirrors on the stones. A few early flowers had opened along the garden wall, tiny, colorless things that trembled in the wind. The monks worked quietly, clearing debris from the drains, lifting the lids from the barrels where rainwater had gathered. Every movement made a sound now, water dripping, tools scraping, sandals brushing wet ground. By midday, the sky deepened to blue. Clouds drifted like slow sails above the valley. The warmth of the sun touched their faces, pale after the months of cold. The abbot stood near the gate, his hands folded in his sleeves. He watched as two brothers carried a small crucifix out into the light and set it upright in the soil near the well. Its shadow stretched across the courtyard, dark and perfect. The refectory smelled of bread. The cook had baked the first loaves since autumn, their crusts dark, their scent filling every corridor. When the brothers gathered to eat, the silence felt different, not the hollow quiet of winter, but full stillness of peace. The sound of breaking bread was almost musical. The abbot raised his hand in blessing. The steam from the bowls curled upward, soft and white. After the meal, they walked the garden paths, heads bowed against the light. Bees had begun to stir near the hives, their low hum blending with the murmur of the river. From the hills came the sound of falling water, snow melting in the gullies, trickling down to join the stream below. In the scriptorium, the scribe set down his quill. The last page of the winter's record lay before him, filled with ink that shimmered faintly in the light. He let it dry, then closed the book. The weight of it felt real in his hands, a season captured in silence and patience. He placed it on the shelf beside the others, the spine marked only with the year. The abbot climbed the narrow stair to the tower. From there, he could see the entire valley, the winding river, the wet gleam of the fields, the smoke from distant hearths rising in Soft columns. The world was still bare, still fragile, but alive. He stood there a long while, the wind pulling gently at his robe. As evening approached, the sky turned to amber, then to violet. The monks gathered for one final prayer. The chapel glowed with the light of candles and the last color of day. Their voices rose together, unhurried, soft, complete. When the final note faded, the abbot stepped forward and spoke, his voice low but clear. Finis Hemis, initium vitae. The end. Winter, the beginning of life. He bowed his head. The brothers did the same. Outside, the air grew cool again, but not cold. The stars emerged early, bright and sharp. The river gleamed beneath them, whispering against its banks. The frogs sang from the reeds. The wind carried their song through the open windows of the chapel. One by one, the candles were extinguished. Smoke curled upward, faint and blue, dissolving into the dark. The abbot stood until the last flame died. Then he turned. The chapel fell into silence. The monastery slept once more, but this time not in endurance, not in waiting. The long night had passed. The earth breathed. The river moved. And within those ancient walls, under the slow turning of the stars, life continued, quiet, unbroken, eternal.